Welcome to the second video of section 4 on building the arena. In this video we're going to take a look at how to implement the algorithm to determine an animal's total score based on its own stats and the stats of the terrain. First, we're going to calculate an animal's combat score. Afterwards, we'll determine what the influence is of the terrain on the animal. And lastly, we're going to combine those two calculations to get a total score. The winner is going to be determined based on that score. Let's start by opening our arena test file and creating a new test suite for our scoring algorithms. We're going to add 3 tests here. One for calculating the combat score for an animal, one for calculating the terrain's influence on that animal, and finally one for calculating the final score of an animal based on its stats and the terrain. Leave these tests blank for now, we're going to get back to them in just a second. Let's inject a couple of animals and a terrain into our testing suite to make things easier to test. We're going to open up a before each block, inject the animals and terrain service, and we'll use those to retrieve the rhino, the alligator, and finally the swamp. We're going to assign these to the this object, which will allow us to access them inside the actual tests. Okay, let's go back to our tests. To keep things simple, we're going to calculate a combat score that goes from, let's say, 0 to 10 points. Let's create a combat score variable that contains the combat score for the rhino. Now we'll test for the combat score value and make sure that it is greater than or equal to 0. We'll also chain another test condition, which will be that the combat score can only be less than or equal to 10. Now that we've got our test spec for the combat scoring algorithm, let's go back to the source code of the arena service and implement it. Keep in mind that this is a really basic app, and as such there won't be any super complex algorithms at play here. First, to make things a little more interesting, let's create some stat weights on top of the file that we can tweak later. Let's favor ferocity by downscaling tenacity just a little bit to 0.8. Next up, create the calculate combat score method that we used in our test. This method takes one argument, namely the animal to calculate the score for. We'll just multiply the animal's ferocity and tenacity with their respective stat weights, and then get the average of that number by dividing it by 2. Let's go back to our test file real quick and then fill in the stub for this second test. So let's just create a variable called terrain influence and then use the arena service, and let's call the method calculate terrain influence. Let's pass in the rhino and the swamp. It's practically the same test as the combat score, only this time we want the terrain's influence to be between 0 and 1. Again, these algorithms aren't super complicated, so we'll implement a really basic terrain influence scoring mechanism. Go back to the arena service and add the calculate terrain influence method. I'm just going to go back to the test real quick and copy the method's name. Alright. And it should take an animal and a terrain. Let's calculate the influence for land and water separately. Let's multiply the animal's land stat with a percentage of the terrain's land stat. We'll do the same thing for the water stat. Finally, return the sum of both stats divided by 20 to get a number between 0 and 1, which is going to act as a percentage. Alright, here we are. The end is in sight. Let's calculate the total score. Go back to the test file again and fill in the stub. Let's calculate the total score for the rhino inside the swamp. Let's call the method calculate total score. Since our combat score is a number between 0 and 10, and is multiplied by the terrain influence that is scored between 0 and 1, so a percentage, It's only logical that this final score will also be a number between 0 and 10. Let's go back to the source file of the Arena service. This method is really easy since we just have to use the other two methods we just created. First, get the animal's combat score, and then get the terrain's influence. We'll just use the method we created earlier and pass in the animal and also the terrain. That's going to tell us how well this animal would perform on this terrain. Multiply the combat score by the terrain influence, and presto, we have our total score. Let's open up a terminal and run our tests to make sure that everything works. Okay, looks good. So just a quick recap. In this video, we've calculated an animal's combat score. We've also calculated a terrain's influence on an animal. And then we've combined both scores to calculate a total score for that animal. Now that we've successfully done that, we can move on to the next video in which we'll fight the match and then determine the outcome.